The large meeting hall was filled with worried voices. Representatives from 47 different alien species sat in their seats, talking among themselves. The emergency meeting had been called for a serious reason, and everyone knew it. Ambassador Thelcora stood at the front of the room. She was from the Viridian Empire, and her body looked like living crystal that caught the light and threw it around the room in rainbow colors. She raised one hand, and the room fell silent. "Another ship is gone," she said, her voice clear and sad. "The Crimson Veil Nebula has taken its 17th victim this year. No one who goes in ever comes back out." The room erupted in noise again. Aliens of all shapes and sizes argued with each other. Some wanted to send military ships to investigate. Others wanted to mark the nebula as forbidden and never speak of it again. In the back corner of the room, a human sat quietly. His name was Jake Morrison, and he was a commander in Earth's space exploration fleet. He was 42 years old, with gray eyes and short brown hair that was starting to turn white at the edges. His face showed the wear of someone who had spent 20 years in deep space. Jake did not join the arguments. He simply watched and listened. This was normal for him. Throughout his career, Jake had earned a strange reputation. He was known as the man who never spoke unless he had something important to say. Some people found this odd. Others found it refreshing. But everyone agreed that when Jake Morrison finally did speak, it was worth listening to. On the large screen at the front of the room, a hologram showed the Crimson Veil Nebula. It was a massive cloud of red and purple gas that twisted and turned like something alive. The image looked beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Kritok, a representative from the Xanthian species, stood up. He looked like a giant insect, with a hard shell and multiple legs. He slammed one of his claws on his desk, making a loud bang. "We must close this area of space," Kritok declared. "Put warships around it. Make sure no one can enter. The Crimson Veil is a place of death. We are fools if we keep sending people there." Many aliens agreed with him, making noises of approval. Thelcora nodded slowly. "Many of us share your concern, Kritok. The losses have been terrible. We have lost not just ships, but hundreds of good people. The best pilots from a dozen different worlds have tried to navigate through the nebula. None of them succeeded." She paused and looked around the room. "The energy readings from inside are impossible. Our instruments show gravity that should crush any ship. Lightning storms that should burn through any shield. Space itself seems to bend and twist in ways that should not be possible." Jake continued to watch the hologram. His eyes moved slowly across the swirling patterns of gas. While others saw only danger and chaos, Jake was looking for something else. He was looking for patterns. Sitting next to Jake was Captain Linda Hayes, the commander of the Earthship Frontier. She had worked with Jake for 5 years and knew him better than most. She noticed that he was studying the nebula very carefully. "You are being quiet," Linda said softly, so only Jake could hear. "Even more than usual. What are you thinking about?" Jake was silent for a moment. Then he said just 3 words. "Someone needs to go." Linda's eyes went wide. She knew what he meant, but she could not believe he was serious. "Jake, you heard them. 17 ships, hundreds of dead. The best pilots in the galaxy have tried." Jake finally looked away from the hologram and met her eyes. "Yes," he said simply. Before Linda could respond, Jake stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate. In the loud room full of arguing aliens, one human standing up should not have meant much. But somehow, people noticed. The arguments began to die down. One by one, the aliens turned to look at the human in the back corner. Jake walked forward. His steps were calm and measured. He moved like someone who was never in a hurry, who had all the time in the world. When he reached the hologram of the nebula, he stopped and studied it again. The entire room was now silent. Everyone was watching him. Thelcora spoke, her voice gentle. "Commander Morrison, do you have something to share with the Council?" Jake reached out and touched the hologram controls. The image zoomed in, showing the heart of the nebula where the swirling gases were thickest. He looked at it for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Everyone had to lean forward to hear him. Every ship that went in followed the rules, Jake said. They used their sensors. They used their computers. They relied on their technology to tell them where to go. He turned to face the council. But the nebula does not follow rules. So why should I? The room erupted in noise again, but this time it was different. Some aliens were shocked. Others were confused. A few were angry. Kritok stood again. You cannot be serious, human. You would throw your life away on a foolish mission. What makes you think you would succeed where so many others have failed? Jake looked at the insect alien. His face showed no emotion. I do not know if I will succeed, he admitted. But I know that if no one tries, nothing will change. And I know that doing the same thing 17 times and expecting a different result is not smart. Thelcora's crystalline form seemed to shimmer with concern. Commander Morrison, we cannot ask you to make this sacrifice. The risk is too great. You are not asking, Jake said simply. I am volunteering. He looked around the room at all the different aliens. Fear makes you predictable. Every pilot who entered that nebula was afraid. They saw danger, so they raised their shields to maximum. They saw chaos, so they trusted their computers to make sense of it. They saw the unknown, so they turned on every sensor they had. Jake paused, then continued. Maybe fear is the problem. Maybe the nebula is not something to overcome with force or technology. Maybe it is something to respect and understand. With that, Jake walked back to his seat. He had said everything he needed to say. The council continued to debate for another 2 hours, but Jake did not speak again. 3 days later, Jake stood in a space station hangar, looking at his ship. It was called the Wanderer, a small scout vessel that had been heavily modified. Most of the extra equipment had been removed. There was no crew quarters because there would be no crew. There was no advanced AI system. Just basic controls, a good engine, and Jake himself. His friend Pete Collins, an engineer who maintained the ship, shook his head sadly. You are really doing this. You know the odds are against you. Jake began checking his flight suit, making sure every seal was tight. The odds were against everyone who tried it their way. I am not them. What makes you so different? Jake paused at the door to his ship. He looked back at Pete, and for just a moment, something like a smile crossed his face. I am not afraid. As the Wanderer launched into space, Jake felt the familiar calm that always came to him before a dangerous mission. Through his front window, he could see the Crimson Veil Nebula waiting in the distance. It looked like a red and purple storm frozen in space. The Wanderer moved through empty space, getting closer to the edge of the Crimson Veil with each passing minute. Jake sat in his pilot seat, his hands resting lightly on the manual flight controls. Most modern ships flew themselves with computers doing all the work. But Jake had turned off most of his automated systems. He wanted full control. A voice crackled over his radio. It was Commander Zektar from the Krillian Defense Force. The Krillians were a warrior species that prided themselves on bravery, but even they stayed far away from the nebula. Human vessel Wanderer, this is your final warning, Zektar said. His voice sounded strange through the translator, full of clicks and hisses. You are approaching the boundary. Turn back now while you still can. Jake looked at the radio but did not answer. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best response. He had said everything he needed to say back at the council meeting. Now was the time for action, not more words. On a massive research station called Helios, hundreds of scientists watched their monitors. The station orbited at a safe distance from the nebula, close enough to study it, but far enough to be safe. Every screen showed tracking data from the Wanderer. Dr. Elena Martinez stood at her station, her arms crossed over her chest. She was Earth's top expert on space phenomena and had studied the Crimson Veil for 3 years. Next to her stood a Viridian scientist named Shimala, whose crystal body reflected the blue light from the screens. He is not slowing down, Shimala observed. Her voice carried a mixture of respect and horror. Elena kept her eyes on the screen. That is just like Jake. He does not believe in hesitation. Does he believe in survival? another scientist asked. Elena did not answer. She had known Jake for 10 years. They had worked together on several missions. She knew he was not suicidal or reckless. He simply had a different way of looking at danger. Where others saw impossible odds, Jake saw a problem that needed a solution. The crimson veil now filled Jake's entire front window. Up close, it looked even more intimidating. The red and purple gases moved in spirals and waves, like an ocean frozen in time. Lightning flickered deep inside, brief flashes of white light that appeared and disappeared in seconds. Jake's instruments began to act strangely. The needles on his gauges jumped and twitched. His sensors showed readings that made no sense. According to his computer, there were gravity fields ahead that should tear his ship apart. There were energy levels that should fry all his systems. There were spatial distortions that physics said should not exist. Most pilots would increase their shields to maximum power when they saw these readings. They would trust their sensors and try to avoid the danger spots. They would let their computers calculate the safest path. Jake did the opposite of all of this. He powered down his shields completely. He switched off most of his sensors, leaving only basic passive scanners running. And most importantly, he turned off his navigation computer and put both hands on the manual controls. His ship's computer made unhappy beeping sounds, warning him that he was doing everything wrong. Jake reached over and muted the warnings. "Trust your eyes," he said, quietly to himself. They were the first words he had spoken since launching. The Wanderer entered the nebula, and the universe changed. The crimson gases surrounded the ship like a thick fog. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Jake could barely see 30 feet in front of him. The gases pressed against his window, swirling in patterns that seemed almost alive. It was like being inside a living storm. His instruments went completely wild. Every alarm that could sound was sounding. Every warning light that could flash was flashing. The computer was screaming at him that he was about to die in a dozen different ways. But Jake was not watching his instruments. His gray eyes were fixed on the gases outside his window. He watched the way they moved. He saw how some currents flowed fast while others moved slow. He noticed patterns in what looked like chaos to his sensors. A massive energy spike appeared directly in front of him. His computer estimated it would arrive in 3 seconds. 3 seconds to react, to dodge, to do something. The spike was big enough to destroy his ship instantly. Jake's response was so subtle that someone watching would barely see him move. He pressed one control stick slightly to the left and adjusted his rear thruster by just a fraction. The Wanderer drifted sideways, moving about 10 feet to the left. The energy spike discharged exactly where his ship had been a moment before. Purple lightning arced through the space, bright enough to light up the entire area. If Jake had been there, the Wanderer would have been vaporized. Back on Helios Station, the scientists saw it happen on their screens. The room went silent. "He should be dead," Kratok stated. The insect alien had come to the station to watch. That discharge had enough power to destroy a battleship. Elena leaned closer to her screen, her eyes wide with realization. "Look at his power distribution," she said to the others. He turned off his shields. He shut down most of his systems. He is flying almost completely dark. "That is madness," Shimala breathed. "How can he navigate without sensors? The gases block all visual reference points." Elena shook her head slowly, a small smile forming on her lips. "Not for a human. We evolved as hunters on Earth. Our ancestors had to track animals through dense forests and thick jungles. We learned to see patterns in nature, to read tiny signs that other species would miss. Our brains are built for this kind of navigation." Deep in the crimson veil, Jake continued forward. His face showed intense concentration but no fear. Sweat ran down his forehead from the effort, but his hands remained perfectly steady on the controls. A gravitational anomaly tried to pull his ship into a deadly spiral. Jake felt it before his instruments registered it. He felt the way the ship wanted to drift, the subtle pull that was trying to take control. He compensated immediately, adjusting his thrust in 3 different directions at once. Something huge moved through the gases ahead of him. It was just a shadow at first, a darker spot in the red fog. As Jake got closer, he he saw what it was. A destroyed ship, one of the previous victims that had tried to make it through the nebula. The hull was twisted and broken, torn apart by forces that should not exist. Most pilots would see this wreckage and feel fear. They would think about the people who died here. They would worry about suffering the same fate. Jake saw something different. He saw information. The wreckage had settled in a specific pattern. The way the debris had spread out showed him which direction the destructive forces had come from. The angle of the broken hull pieces told him where the safe path was. Each piece of destroyed ship was like a road sign, showing him where not to go. He followed the wreckage trail, using the ruins of failed missions as guides. Each destroyed ship taught him something important about the nebula. Hours passed, though Jake lost track of time. Inside the nebula, there was no day or night, just the eternal red twilight of the swirling gases. His body ached from the constant tiny adjustments needed to keep his ship on course. His eyes burned from staring so intently at the gases. His arms felt heavy from holding the controls. But he never considered turning back. A new pattern appeared in the gases ahead. They swirled differently here, faster and tighter, like water going down a drain. Jake realized he was approaching the center of the nebula, the deepest point that no one had ever reached and survived. Every survival instinct in his body told him to turn around. He had already gone farther than anyone else. He had proven his point. He could go back now and still be a hero. But Jake Morrison had not come here to go halfway. He had come here to solve the mystery. He pushed forward, and the crimson veil seemed to close behind him like a trap shutting. There was no going back now. The only way out was through. The gases grew thicker. The energy spikes came faster. Gravitational fields pulled at his ship from multiple directions at once. Jake's hands moved constantly on the controls, making hundreds of tiny adjustments every minute. And then, suddenly, the gases opened up. Jake found himself in a clear space, a bubble of calm in the middle of the storm. The sphere was about 6 miles across. The swirling gases formed walls around it, but inside this space, everything was peaceful. Jake let out a long breath and allowed his shoulders to relax for the first time since entering the nebula. He had made it to the center, but what he saw there made him forget all about his exhaustion. At the exact center of the calm space floated something impossible. It was a structure, a building in space, but unlike anything Jake had ever seen. It was huge, at least a mile across, made from materials that seemed to shift between solid and liquid. Crystal spires jutted out from a central core that pulsed with the same crimson light as the nebula. Jake kept the Wanderer completely still, floating in the calm space while he studied the ancient structure. His finger hovered over the thrust controls, ready to move at any second, but he did not take any action yet. Moving without understanding would be a fatal mistake. The structure was beautiful in a terrifying way. The crystal spires caught the red light of the nebula and bent it into strange angles. The central core pulsed with a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. Every few seconds, energy would build up in the core and then release in controlled bursts. On Helios Station, the scientists were receiving Jake's data transmission. The signal was weak and filled with static, but it was enough to see what he was seeing. Dr. Alan Chen, a physicist from Earth, stared at his screen with his mouth open. His hands shook as he worked his controls. "This is impossible," he whispered. "The energy signature. It is using technology we do not understand. This structure is millions of years old." Elena stood next to him, her face pale. "Jake, if you can hear me, be extremely careful. That thing is active. It is putting out defensive fields in all directions." Jake heard her voice through the heavy static, but did not reply. He was focused completely on watching the structure. His training as a pilot had taught him one important lesson. Before you act, understand the pattern. He watched the energy pulses. He counted the seconds between each one. He noticed which direction they went. After watching for 10 minutes, he began to see it. The structure was not attacking randomly. It was following a pattern, like a lighthouse beam that sweeps in a circle. The energy pulses happened every 43 seconds. They swept through the calm space in a specific sequence: north, east, south, west, then straight up and straight down. Each pulse covered a different zone. And between the pulses, there were safe spots where nothing happened. Jake realized what had killed the other ships. When they arrived at the structure, they had immediately started scanning it with their sensors. They had sent signals toward it, trying to learn what it was. The structure had interpreted those active scans as attacks and had responded by firing all its weapons at once. But Jake had not scanned it. He had simply drifted into the calm space with most of his systems powered down. The structure had not seen him as a threat, so it continued its normal pattern instead of going into full attack mode. Jake finally keyed his radio. Helios Station, Morrison here. The structure is automated. It is a defense system, but it only attacks active threats. It is following a predictable pattern. Elena's voice came back, urgent. Jake, we are reading a massive energy buildup. Something is changing. Jake saw it too. The central core was glowing brighter. The pulses were coming faster. Something had triggered a response. Maybe his radio transmission. Maybe just the fact that he had been there too long. Whatever the reason, the structure was preparing to eliminate him. His computer started screaming warnings. A massive energy discharge was building, one that would fill the entire calm space. There would be nowhere to hide, no way to dodge. In 30 seconds, the structure would release enough power to destroy everything within 6 miles. Most pilots would panic. They would try to run, try to escape back through the nebula. But Jake knew he could not outrun an energy wave in this confined space. And even if he could get to the nebula, he would never make it through while running at full speed. The nebula required slow, careful navigation. Jake made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. He aimed the Wanderer directly at the structure and pushed his engines to maximum power. On Helios Station, the scientists watched in horror as Jake's ship accelerated toward the ancient device. "He is committing suicide," Zektar said flatly. "No," Elena whispered, suddenly understanding. "He is doing the only thing that might work." The energy wave began to expand outward from the structure's core, a sphere of destructive force that grew larger every second. Jake pushed his ship faster, racing toward the structure instead of away from it. At the last possible second, Jake saw what he was looking for. A gap between two of the crystal spires, an opening just barely wide enough for his ship. He adjusted his course with precise control and threaded the Wanderer through the gap. The energy wave hit the structure's outer surface and exploded outward in all directions. But it could not penetrate the structure's own core. The ancient device was designed to protect itself from its own weapons. By flying inside the structure, Jake had found the one safe place in the entire comm zone. The wave passed around the outside, turning the comm space into a hell of energy and light. If Jake had been out there, he would have been vaporized instantly. But inside the structure, protected by the same shields that powered it, the Wanderer was completely safe. Jake let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His hands ached from gripping the controls so hard. But he was alive. He looked around at his new surroundings. The inside of the structure was even stranger than the outside. Glowing conduits ran along the walls, carrying energy in patterns that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. Geometric shapes floated in the air, rotating slowly. Everything hummed with power. And in the very center, Jake saw a chamber, a room. He carefully maneuvered the Wanderer deeper into the structure, moving slowly through the maze of energy conduits and floating geometry. The ship's sensors were going crazy, but Jake ignored them. He was navigating by sight, trusting his eyes more than his instruments. The chamber grew larger as he approached. It was spherical, about 200 feet across, with smooth walls that seemed to be made of liquid metal. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing symbols and equations that Jake could not read. But one thing was clear. This was a control room. Whoever built this structure had left a way to operate it, and they had left it accessible, as if waiting for someone to find it. Jake brought the Wanderer to a complete stop. He sat in his pilot's chair for a long moment, just breathing and thinking. Every choice he made from this point on could mean life or death. He keyed his radio again. "Helios Station, I am inside the structure. I found a control chamber. Preparing to investigate." Elena's voice came through the static. "Jake, you do not know what that technology will do. It could be trapped. It could be programmed to kill anyone who touches it. It could, Jake agreed, but I did not come this far to stop now. He began the process of sealing his flight suit and preparing to leave his ship. The atmosphere inside the structure registered as breathable on his sensors. But Jake did not trust that. He would keep his suit sealed. Before he opened the airlock, Jake paused. He thought about all the pilots who had died trying to reach this place. He thought about the 17 ships and the hundreds of people who had been killed by the structure's defenses. They had all been brave. They had all been skilled. But they had all made the same mistake. They had approached the unknown as something to conquer, something to overcome with force or technology. Jake had survived by doing the opposite. He had approached it with respect, with patience, with a willingness to observe before acting. And somehow, that had made all the difference. He opened the airlock and stepped out into the ancient chamber. The air felt strange, thick and heavy, even though his sensors said it was normal. The gravity was slightly lighter than Earth normal. The temperature was cool but not uncomfortable. Jake's magnetic boots clicked against the metal floor as he walked toward the holographic displays. As he got closer, they began to change. The strange symbols shifted and reformed, as if the system was trying to find a language he could understand. After a few seconds, the symbols became images. Jake saw a picture of his own solar system, with Earth marked by a glowing point. The system recognized him as human. More images appeared, flowing past him in a stream. They showed the structure being built. They showed it being placed in the nebula. They showed ships approaching and being destroyed. And they showed other structures like this one, scattered across the galaxy. Jake realized he was watching a message, a recording left by whoever built this place. And as the images continued, he began to understand why the structure was here and what it was meant to do. The ancient builders had not created a weapon. They had created a test of wisdom, a test of patience, a test to see which species had evolved beyond simple aggression and greed. Only those who could approach the unknown without trying to dominate it would be allowed to pass. 17 ships had failed the test because they had approached it as conquerors. Jake had passed the test because he had approached it as a student. The holographic display changed again, showing a control panel. The message was clear. Jake could deactivate the structure's defenses. He could make the nebula safe for travel. All he had to do was reach out and touch the controls. Jake stood before the panel, his hand hovering over the glowing interface. He had come all this way. He had risked everything. And now, with a simple touch, he could change everything. But something made him hesitate. This was technology he did not understand, left by a civilization that had disappeared millions of years ago. What if there were consequences he could not predict? What if turning it off was the wrong choice? Then Jake thought about all the people who had died here. He thought about the fear that kept other species away from places like this. He thought about how much the galaxy could learn if they were not afraid. He reached out and placed his hand on the control panel. Jake stood in the control chamber, watching as the holographic displays continued to show him information. Now that he had deactivated the defensive systems, the ancient structure seemed eager to share its secrets. Images and diagrams flowed past him, each one revealing more about the civilization that had built this place. The builders called themselves the progenitors. They had existed millions of years ago, long before any of the current galactic species had evolved beyond primitive life. They had been incredibly advanced, masters of technology that current science could barely imagine. But they had not been conquerors. The images made that clear. The progenitors had explored the galaxy peacefully, studying and learning. And when their time came to an end, they had left behind gifts for the species that would come after them. Jake watched as the displays showed him the truth. The Crimson Veil structure was one of hundreds scattered across the galaxy. Each one guarded valuable knowledge and technology. Each one was protected by defenses designed to test anyone who found it. The tests were not about strength or intelligence. They were about character. Only species that had evolved beyond simple aggression could pass. Only those who approached the unknown with respect, instead of fear or greed, would be given access to the progenitor gifts. A new holographic image appeared, showing a star map. Dozens of locations were marked with glowing points. Jake realized he was looking at the positions of other progenitor structures. Most were in areas of space that current species avoided, places considered too dangerous to explore. Now Jake understood why. The structures were designed to seem dangerous. The defenses created fear, and fear kept away those who were not ready. Only someone willing to face the impossible without weapons or armor could succeed. The holographic display shifted again, showing Jake something new. Technical diagrams appeared, blueprints for technology far beyond current understanding. Power generation systems that could create unlimited energy, medical devices that could cure any disease, ships that could travel faster than anything currently built. The progenitors were offering all of this to whoever passed their tests. But the gifts came with responsibility. The species that gained this knowledge would need to be wise enough to use it properly. Jake studied the information carefully, his mind working to understand as much as possible. His suit's computer was recording everything, storing the data to share with scientists later. But Jake wanted to understand it himself, not just collect it. After what felt like hours, the holographic displays began to fade. The structure had shown him everything it could. Now it was waiting to see what he would do with the knowledge. Jake turned back toward the Wanderer. It was time to leave. But as he walked toward his ship, he noticed something. A small alcove in the chamber wall that he had not seen before. Inside it was a physical object, not a hologram. A crystal device about the size of his fist, glowing with soft blue light. Jake approached it carefully. As he got close, a holographic message appeared, showing him that the device was a key. With it, he could access any progenitor structure in the galaxy. The defenses would recognize the key and allow him safe passage. He picked up the crystal, feeling its weight in his hand. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. This was a tool that would let him explore all the other test sites if he chose to. Jake secured the crystal in a storage pocket on his suit and returned to the Wanderer. As he climbed back into the pilot's seat, he felt exhausted. The last several hours had pushed him to his absolute limits, both physically and mentally. But he had succeeded. Against all odds, he had found the heart of the Crimson Veil and survived. Jake began the process of launching his ship from inside the structure. He carefully maneuvered back through the maze of energy conduits and geometric shapes. Everything was calmer now with the defenses offline, but he still moved slowly and carefully. As he emerged from the structure and entered the calm space, Jake saw that the energy waves were gone. The violent pulses had stopped. The ancient device just floated there peacefully, its purpose fulfilled for now. Jake set his course back toward the nebula's edge. The return trip would be much easier with the defenses offline, but he still needed to navigate carefully through the gases. He keyed his radio. "Helios Station, this is Morrison. I am beginning my exit from the nebula. The structure is secured and the defenses are offline. You can begin sending science teams through the marked safe corridor." Elena's voice came back immediately, clear now, without the heavy interference. "Jake, we saw what happened. The entire nebula has calmed. You actually did it. You really did it." Jake heard the emotion in her voice and allowed himself a small smile. "Just followed the pattern," he said simply. "There are 47 ambassadors here who want to talk to you when you get back. The Galactic Council is calling this the most important discovery in modern history." "They can wait," Jake replied. "I need to focus on flying." He cut the transmission and focused on navigating. The return trip through the nebula was indeed much easier. The violent energy spikes were gone. The deadly gravitational anomalies had calmed. But the gases were still thick, and Jake still needed to pay attention to where he was going. As he flew, Jake thought about what he had learned. The progenitors had left behind a galaxy-wide treasure hunt. Hundreds of test sites, each one guarding incredible knowledge. And now, Jake had the key to access all of them. But more importantly, he had proven something. He had shown that the test could be beaten. And he had shown the key to success. Approach the unknown with patience and respect, not with fear or aggression. The galaxy's species had spent generations avoiding the progenitor sites, treating them as death traps to be feared. But Jake had revealed the truth. They were not traps. They were invitations, extended to any species wise enough to accept them properly. After 2 hours of careful navigation, Jake saw the edge of the nebula ahead. The crimson gases began to thin out, and beyond them he could see normal space. He could see the lights of dozens of ships waiting there, watching for his return. Jake pushed through the final layer of gas and emerged from the crimson veil. Immediately, his radio exploded with messages. Ships from every species hailed him, congratulating him, asking questions, requesting interviews. Jake turned off his radio. He would deal with all of that later. Right now, he just wanted to enjoy the view of clear space. He pointed the Wanderer toward Helios Station and increased his speed. As he flew, he looked back at the nebula one last time. It looked different now, gentler somehow. The angry red had faded to a soft rose color. The violent swirling had calmed to peaceful movement. The galaxy's deadliest nebula was deadly no more. When Jake docked at Helios Station an hour later, he found a crowd waiting for him. Scientists, military officers, ambassadors, and reporters from a dozen different species all pressed close to the docking bay windows, trying to get a look at the human who had achieved the impossible. Jake took his time shutting down the Wanderer's systems. He removed his flight suit and put on a clean uniform. He ran a hand through his hair and took a deep breath. Then he opened the airlock and stepped out into the crowd. The noise was overwhelming. Everyone was talking at once, shouting questions, making demands. Flashbulbs went off from alien cameras. Translators created a babble of different languages all mixed together. Jake stood quietly, waiting for the noise to die down. It took several minutes, but eventually, people realized he was not going to speak until they were quiet. The crowd slowly fell silent. Ambassador Thelcora pushed through the crowd, her crystal form refracting the lights into rainbow patterns. She stopped in front of Jake and bowed deeply, a gesture of respect from her species. "Commander Morrison," she said formally, "on behalf of the Galactic Council, I must express our profound gratitude. You have accomplished what we thought impossible. You have opened a door that we believed was closed forever." Jake nodded acknowledgement but said nothing. Thelcora continued. "The Council wishes to bestow upon you the Star of Valor, our highest honor. We also wish to promote you to the rank of Admiral and place you in command of the new Progenitor Initiative." Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I appreciate the offer, Ambassador, but I must decline the promotion. I am a pilot, not an administrator." The crowd murmured in surprise. Thelcora's crystalline features somehow showed confusion. "But surely you wish to lead the effort to explore the other progenitor sites? You are the only one who has succeeded." "I do want to explore them," Jake admitted, "but I work better alone. Give the leadership position to someone who enjoys meetings and paperwork. I will just fly." Elena pushed through the crowd and stood next to Jake. She smiled at him, understanding completely. "What he means, Ambassador, is that Jake Morrison does what Jake Morrison does best. He explores. He solves problems. He finds solutions. But he does it his way, in his time, on his terms." Jake looked at Elena and nodded. That was exactly what he meant. Thelcora was silent for a moment. Then she bowed again. "Very well, Commander. We will establish the Progenitor Initiative and assign administrative staff. But you will have complete freedom to explore as you see fit. All we ask is that you share what you discover." "Agreed," Jake said simply. The crowd wanted more. They wanted speeches, interviews, detailed explanations of everything that had happened. But Jake had said all he was going to say. 3 weeks after Jake's return from the Crimson Veil, the galaxy had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The discovery of the progenitor structures had become the biggest news in modern history. Every news channel on every world was talking about it. Scientists were forming teams to study the ancient technology. Governments were arguing about who had rights to explore which structures. And in the middle of all this chaos, Jake Morrison was trying to find a quiet place to eat lunch. He sat in a small cafe on Helios Station, a place that most people did not know about. It was tucked away in a maintenance section, frequented only by engineers and technicians. Jake liked it because no one bothered him here. Elena found him anyway. She always did. "There you are," she said, sitting down across from him without asking. I have been looking everywhere for you. The council wants another briefing. Jake took a bite of his sandwich and chewed slowly before responding. I gave them 3 briefings already, and I sent them all the data recordings. What more do they want? They want you to lead expeditions to the other progenitor sites. They have identified 12 structures that are in accessible areas. They want to send large teams with military escorts and full science crews. Jake put down his sandwich and looked at Elena directly. Large teams will fail. Military escorts will trigger the defenses. They learned nothing from what happened at the Crimson Veil. Elena sighed. That is what I told them. But they do not want to send pilots alone into danger. They think you just got lucky. Lucky, Jake repeated, his voice flat. I spent hours studying the patterns. I risked everything based on careful observation, and they think it was luck. I know, Elena said sympathetically, but you know how politics work. Everyone wants to be part of the next big discovery. No one wants to let one human pilot take all the glory. Jake picked up his sandwich again. I do not care about glory. I care about doing it right. They sat in silence for a moment. Elena watched Jake eat, seeing the exhaustion in his face. The past 3 weeks had been hard on him. Constant interviews, briefings, meetings. Jake was not built for this kind of attention. He was built for quiet spaces and difficult problems. What if I could get you out of here? Elena asked suddenly. Jake looked up, interested. I have been studying the progenitor data, Elena continued. I found references to a structure in the Outer Rim territories. It is far from any major trade routes, in a region called the Bone Fields. The area is named for all the derelict ships floating there. Navigation is nearly impossible because of asteroid density. Sounds perfect, Jake said. Elena smiled. I thought you might say that. The Council does not even know about this one yet. It was buried deep in the database. If you left quietly, you could have a few weeks before anyone noticed. Time to explore on your own terms. Jake considered this. The idea of getting away from the crowds and the politics was appealing, and another progenitor test would give him something meaningful to focus on. What do you get out of this? He asked Elena. You're taking a risk by not reporting it to the Council immediately. Elena leaned back in her chair. I get good data and interesting research. Plus, I trust you more than I trust a committee. If there is something important in the bone fields, I want you to find it properly, not have it rushed by politicians looking for quick results. Jake finished his sandwich and stood up. When can the Wanderer be ready? It is already being prepped. Pete is doing the maintenance now. I took the liberty of assuming you would say yes. Jake almost smiled. Elena knew him too well. Give me the coordinates. I will leave tonight. 8 hours later, Jake sat in the Wanderer's cockpit, running through pre-flight checks. The ship had been fully serviced and restocked. Pete had even installed some upgrades, though Jake had insisted on keeping the manual controls exactly as they were. Pete stood at the airlock, doing his final inspection. You know, most people who almost died would take a vacation, maybe spend time on a beach somewhere. I did not almost die, Jake corrected. I succeeded. Right? And now you are going back out to do it again. Jake, there are 63 of these structures out there. You do not have to explore them all yourself. Jake looked at his friend. Someone needs to show others how to do it properly. The only way to teach that is by example. Pete shook his head but smiled. You are crazy, you know that? Maybe, Jake agreed. But it is the useful kind of crazy. After Pete left, Jake sat alone in the quiet cockpit. He pulled out the progenitor crystal key and held it in his hand, feeling its warmth. The key would let him access any structure without triggering the defenses. But Jake had decided not to use it except in emergencies. The tests were important. They were designed to ensure that only the right kind of visitors gained access to the progenitor gifts. If Jake just bypassed them with the key, he would be cheating. He would be taking shortcuts that defeated the entire purpose. No, Jake would face each test properly. He would approach each structure with the same patience and respect he had shown at the Crimson Veil. And if he succeeded, he would prove that the progenitor lessons could be learned and repeated. He secured the crystal in his locker and began the launch sequence. The Wanderer departed Helios Station quietly, slipping away while most of the facility slept. Jake set his course for the outer rim, toward the bone fields and whatever waited there. The journey would take 3 weeks at normal speed. Jake could use the time to study everything that was known about the bone fields region. According to historical records, the area had claimed hundreds of ships over the centuries. Most spacers avoided it completely. But Jake was not most spacers. He settled into the familiar routine of long-distance travel. Days blended together in the peaceful monotony of empty space. Jake spent his time reviewing data, exercising to keep his body sharp, and thinking about what he had learned from the Crimson Veil. On the 10th day of travel, Jake received a message from Linda Hayes, his captain from the frontier. Jake, the council figured out you left. They are not happy. I am supposed to order you to return immediately. There was a pause, then Linda's voice took on a different tone. But my communication system seems to be experiencing technical difficulties. I am not sure this message will reach you. Good luck out there, Commander. Bring back something interesting. Jake allowed himself a rare smile. Linda understood. She knew that Jake worked best when left alone to do things his way. 2 days later, another message came in. This one was from Ambassador Thelcora. Commander Morrison, while we are disappointed that you departed without authorization, we understand your methods. The Council has voted to grant you official status as an independent explorer. You have full authority to investigate progenitor sites as you see fit. All we ask is that you share your findings when you are able. Safe travels. Jake was surprised. He had expected anger, maybe even orders to return under threat of arrest. Instead, the Council was giving him exactly what he wanted: freedom to explore on his own terms. Perhaps they had learned something after all. On the 20th day, Jake's sensors detected the first signs of the bone fields. Derelict ships appeared on his screens, drifting in the void. Some were centuries old, their hulls corroded and broken. Others were relatively recent, still showing signs of the catastrophic failures that had killed them. Jake slowed his speed and began navigating carefully. The asteroid density was indeed extreme. Rocks of all sizes filled the area, creating a deadly maze that shifted constantly due to complex gravitational interactions. And somewhere in the middle of all this chaos was a progenitor structure. Jake spent 2 days slowly working his way deeper into the bone fields. His approach was the same as at the Crimson Veil: careful observation, minimal power usage, patience above all else. He watched how the asteroids moved. He studied the patterns in the debris. He learned the rhythm of this dangerous space. On the 3rd day, he saw it. Through a gap in the asteroids, Jake spotted something that did not belong. A structure, smaller than the one at Crimson Veil, but clearly of similar design. It floated in a relatively clear space, protected by the asteroids around it. But this test would be different. The Crimson Veil had been about navigating energy and gravitational anomalies. The Bone Fields test was about precision navigation through physical obstacles. One wrong move, one collision with an asteroid, and the Wanderer would join the other derelicts floating here. Jake studied the asteroid field between him and the structure. He spent 4 hours just watching, learning the patterns. The asteroids were not random. They moved in predictable orbits, influenced by the gravitational pull of larger rocks and the distant sun. He began to see the path. It was like threading a needle while the needle was moving. Timing would be everything. Jake took a deep breath and put his hands on the manual controls. No computer could calculate this. It required human intuition, the ability to see patterns and make instant adjustments. It required the same skills that had gotten him through the Crimson Veil. The Wanderer moved forward into the asteroid field. An asteroid the size of a house drifted past, missing Jake's ship by less than 10 feet. He adjusted his course slightly, following in the asteroid's wake. Another rock approached from the left. Jake slowed down, letting it pass in front of him. It was like a deadly dance. Jake moved in rhythm with the asteroids, finding the spaces between them, using their movements to guide his path. His hands never stopped moving on the controls. Tiny adjustments, constant corrections, reading the pattern as it unfolded. Hours passed. Sweat ran down Jake's face, His arms ached. His eyes burned from the intense concentration, but he kept moving forward, getting closer to the structure with each careful movement. A massive asteroid tumbled toward him, spinning end over end. Jake saw the gap. The bone field structure was different from the one at Crimson Vale. It was smaller, only about half a mile across, and its design was more compact. Where the Crimson Vale structure had been all spires and flowing shapes, this one was geometric and precise. Sharp angles and perfect symmetry defined its form. Jake approached slowly, keeping the Wanderer at minimal power. He had learned his lesson well. The progenitor structures responded to intent as much as action. Approaching with weapons hot or sensors blazing would trigger defensive responses. But approaching quietly, with respect, might earn him safe passage. The structure began to glow as Jake got closer. Panels on its surface lit up in sequence, creating patterns of light that swept across its metallic skin. Jake recognized it as the same kind of scanning system he had seen before. The structure was examining him, deciding if he was a threat. Jake kept his hands steady on the controls and waited. Patience had served him well so far. After several minutes, the glowing patterns changed. A port opened in the side of the structure, an entrance just large enough for the Wanderer to fit through. Jake understood the invitation. He guided his ship carefully through the opening. Inside, he found himself in a docking chamber. Mechanical arms extended from the walls and gently secured the Wanderer in place. Jake went through his shutdown procedures, then sealed his flight suit and prepared to exit the ship. As he stepped out into the chamber, Jake noticed immediately that the gravity was different here. It was lighter, perhaps 60% of Earth normal. His movements felt almost bouncy until he adjusted his stride. A corridor stretched ahead of him, lit by the same soft blue glow he had seen in the Crimson Vale control room. Jake followed it, his magnetic boots clicking softly on the metal floor. The corridor curved and branched, creating a maze, but Jake noticed symbols on the walls. They seemed to be directing him, showing him the path to follow. After several minutes of walking, Jake entered a large chamber. This one was different from the Crimson Vale control room. Instead of holographic displays floating in the air, this room had physical artifacts on display. Objects sat on pedestals, protected by transparent barriers. Jake moved closer to examine them. He saw devices that might have been tools, though their purpose was unclear. He saw art pieces that were beautiful in alien ways, and he saw weapons, though they looked nothing like any weapon Jake had ever seen. At the center of the room stood a larger pedestal with something that caught Jake's attention immediately. It was a sphere of golden metal, perfectly smooth, about the size of a basketball. As Jake approached, it began to glow from within. Holographic text appeared in the air above the sphere, and this time, Jake could read it. The progenitor systems had learned human language from their interaction with him at Crimson Vale. The text explained that the sphere was a data repository containing knowledge specific to this test site. Jake reached out carefully and touched the sphere. Information flooded into his mind, not as words or images, but as pure understanding. He learned that the bone field structure was a training facility. The progenitors had used places like this to teach their young ones the skills of precise navigation and spatial awareness. The asteroid field outside was not a natural formation. The progenitors had created it, arranging the rocks in specific patterns that followed mathematical principles. Learning to navigate through it taught patience, timing, and respect for the physical laws of the universe. The data also revealed something else. This structure contained information about progenitor navigation technology. Ships that could move through space in ways current species could barely imagine. Not faster than light travel, which most civilizations had already achieved, but something more elegant. Ships that worked with space rather than forcing their way through it. Jake spent hours in the chamber, learning everything the sphere had to teach. His suit's computer recorded all of it, storing the data to bring back to human scientists. But Jake also worked to understand it himself, to grasp the principles behind the technology. Finally, when he had absorbed all he could, Jake turned to leave. As he walked back toward the corridor, he noticed something. On a small pedestal near the exit sat another crystal key, identical to the one he had found at Crimson Vale. Jake picked it up and examined it. The holographic text explained that each structure contained a key. Collecting them all would grant access to something called the Prime Repository, the central library of all progenitor knowledge. But the location of the Prime Repository was not revealed. Jake would need to visit more structures to learn where it was. He secured the second key in his suit pocket next to the first one and made his way back to the Wanderer. The return trip through the structure's corridors felt shorter, as if the building itself was helping him find his way. As Jake launched from the docking chamber and began the careful journey back through the asteroid field, he thought about everything he had learned. The progenitors had not just left technology behind. They had left a teaching system, a way for younger species to grow and learn at their own pace. The tests were not meant to keep people out. They were meant to ensure that only those who were ready could enter. And by completing them properly, species would learn the lessons they needed to use the progenitor gifts wisely. Jake navigated back through the asteroids with more confidence this time. He understood their movements better now, saw the patterns more clearly. The journey that had taken hours on the way in took only 90 minutes on the way out. As the Wanderer cleared the bone fields and entered open space, Jake activated his long-range communications. "This is Commander Morrison to any receiving station. I have successfully explored the Bonefields progenitor site. Transmitting data now. The structure is secured and safe for follow-up research teams." He sent the data packet and then leaned back in his seat. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind felt clear and sharp. He had proven that his success at Crimson Vale was not luck. The progenitor tests could be beaten with the right approach. A reply came in after a few minutes. It was Elena, her voice excited. "Jake, the data is incredible. The navigation technology alone will revolutionize ship design. When can you return to Helios Station for debriefing?" Jake looked at his star charts. The progenitor database had revealed the locations of 63 structures. He had now visited 2 of them. That left 61 more to explore. "Negative on returning to Helios," Jake replied. "I'm going to continue mapping the structures. There is too much to learn and not enough time to waste on meetings." There was a pause. Then Elena's voice came back, understanding in her tone. "I figured you would say that. The Council approved your independent status. You have authorization to continue as you see fit. Just try to check in occasionally. Some of us worry." "Understood," Jake said. "Morrison out." He plotted a course to the next structure. According to the database, it was located in a region of space affected by unusual temporal distortions. Time moved differently there, making it nearly impossible to navigate using conventional methods. It sounded like exactly the kind of challenge Jake was looking for. As the Wanderer jumped to faster-than-light speed, Jake thought about the changes happening across the galaxy. The discovery of the progenitor structures was forcing every species to reconsider their approach to exploration. Military conquests and aggressive expansion were giving way to more thoughtful methods. And it had all started because one human pilot had refused to let fear control his actions. Jake knew his place in history was secure. People would talk about his achievements for generations. But that had never been his motivation. He explored because it was what he did, who he was. The fame and recognition were just side effects. What mattered was the exploration itself. The unknown called to him and he answered, not with weapons or bravado, but with patience and respect. And that made all the difference. Weeks turned into months as Jake continued his solitary journey across the galaxy. He visited structure after structure, each one presenting a unique test. He navigated through plasma storms and quantum anomalies. He solved puzzles that required thinking in 4 dimensions. He faced challenges that pushed him to his absolute limits. And each time he succeeded. Word of his achievements spread. Other pilots began attempting the progenitor tests, using Jake's methods as a guide. Some succeeded, many failed. But slowly, more and more species were learning the lessons the progenitors had left behind. Jake collected keys from each structure he visited, building a collection that represented his growing knowledge. With each new key, the locations of more structures were revealed. The Prime Repository remained hidden, but Jake was getting closer to finding it. After 6 months of continuous exploration, Jake had visited 15 structures. He had faced tests of navigation, problem-solving, courage, and wisdom. Each success taught him more about the progenitors and their vision for the galaxy. But Jake had also learned something about himself. He had discovered that his lack of fear was not just a personality trait. It was a choice. Every time he approached a new structure, every time he faced a new test, fear tried to creep in. But Jake chose not to let it control him. He acknowledged the danger, respected it, and then moved forward anyway. That was the real lesson the progenitors were teaching. Fear was natural, but it did not have to be in charge. Wisdom meant feeling fear and acting correctly anyway. Jake sat in the Wanderer's cockpit, looking at the stars. Somewhere out there were 48 more structures to explore, 48 more tests to pass. And beyond them, the Prime Repository waited with its secrets. It would take years to complete the journey. Years of solitary travel, dangerous challenges, and pushing his limits. Most people would find that prospect daunting or lonely. Jake found it perfect. He had started this journey by facing the galaxy's deadliest nebula. He had proven that one silent human with zero fear could accomplish what entire fleets could not. And now, he would continue proving it, one structure at a time, until the full legacy of the progenitors was revealed. The Wanderer's engines hummed steadily as the ship traveled through the darkness between stars. Inside, Jake Morrison sat quietly, thinking about the next challenge, the next unknown, the next mystery waiting to be solved. The galaxy had tried to scare him with the Crimson Veil. It had tested him in the bone fields. It would throw more challenges at him in the months and years ahead. But Jake would face them all the same way he had faced everything else in his life, with patience, respect, and absolutely no fear. The stars stretched endlessly ahead, full of ancient secrets and modern possibilities. And somewhere among them, one silent human pilot continued his work, teaching the galaxy that the greatest courage was not found in grand gestures or loud declarations, but in the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who they were. Jake Morrison had met the galaxy's deadliest nebula and changed everything. But for him, it was just the beginning. The real journey was still ahead, full of wonders yet to be discovered and lessons yet to be learned. And he would face it all exactly as he had faced everything else. One challenge at a time, one day at a time, one quiet decision at a time. The galaxy had found its explorer. And Jake Morrison had found his purpose. Together, they would unlock the secrets left behind by a civilization that had known the most important truth of all. The universe was not something to conquer, but something to understand. And understanding required patience, respect, and the absence of fear. He needed and accelerated slightly, threading through the narrow space between two spinning rocks. The Wanderer's hull scraped against one asteroid with a screech of metal on stone, but Jake kept his course steady. And then, suddenly, he was through. The Wanderer emerged into the clear space around the structure, and the deadly asteroid field was behind him. Jake sat back in his seat, breathing hard. His entire body trembled from exhaustion and adrenaline. But he had made it. The bone field structure waited ahead, its ancient form pulsing with the same kind of energy he had seen at the Crimson Veil. Another test awaited, another mystery to solve. Jake Morrison smiled. This was what he lived for. The galaxy's second deadliest region had just met the same silent human. And once again, zero fear remained. He turned to Elena. I need food and sleep, in that order. Elena laughed and took his arm, helping him push through the crowd. As they walked away, Jake heard the disappointed murmurs of people who wanted more from their hero. But Jake Morrison had never been good at being a hero. He was just a pilot who saw a problem and solved it. Nothing more, nothing less. And tomorrow, he would start preparing for the next challenge. The structure responded immediately. The pulsing light from the core began to slow down. The energy readings on Jake's suit displays started to decrease. Throughout the Crimson Veil, the deadly anomalies began to fade. On Helios Station, alarm bells rang as every sensor registered the massive change in the nebula's energy signature. The gravitational spikes are normalizing, Alan Chen reported, his voice full of wonder. The electromagnetic interference is dropping. The anomalies are disappearing. He is actually doing it. Elena watched her screen, tears forming in her eyes. Jake, you crazy, brilliant man, you actually did it. Through the station's observation windows, they could all see the change. The crimson veil was transforming before their eyes. The angry red glow was fading to a softer pink. The violent swirling was calming to gentle movement. For the first time in recorded history, the nebula looked peaceful. Inside the control chamber, Jake pulled his hand back from the panel. It was done. The test was over and he had passed. The structure was clearly artificial. Someone had built this. But who? And when? And most importantly, why? Jake stared at it, his mind racing with questions. This was the source. This was what had been killing ships. But it was not a natural phenomenon. It was a machine, an ancient device left here by someone long ago. His instruments came back online in the calm space and immediately started screaming again. The structure was putting out energy readings that made no scientific sense. It was creating gravitational waves, electromagnetic pulses, and types of radiation that Jake had never heard of. This was the most dangerous thing Jake had ever encountered. One wrong move and he would die instantly. Jake Morrison smiled. Finally, he understood. And understanding was the first step to survival. Behind him, dozens of ships from different species watched. They all kept their distance, staying in the safe zone. They waited to see if the crazy human would really fly into the deadliest place in the galaxy. Jake set his course and increased his speed. The Wanderer moved forward, heading straight toward the swirling gases of the Crimson Veil. The galaxy was about to learn what one quiet human could do when he had no fear at all.